Okay, we're ready.
Good morning, good afternoon everyone, and happy 2017. Welcome to our webinar on carbon disclosure and climate risk in sovereign bonds. It's quite a hefty way to start the new year, but it is great to see so many of you online. We have over 100 participants. A quick introduction, my name is Maximilian Horster. I'm a partner in the South Pole Group, and I will be the moderator today. South Pole Group.
Max, sorry, just to confirm now, because I'm a bit on mine. It still says that I can record.
Mm-hmm.
So can we just for the sake of being sure?
Mm-hmm.
Can we close this and see if you get? So Susan, you're supposed to get a pop-up window that tells you to format the recording.
Yeah. So just so you know what's on my screen, there's a red button that says stop recording. So it means it has started. And at the very bottom it says a big red button that says this session is being recorded.
Okay, so that I think, so actually it says on my, it says here as well that the session is being recorded. So can we just start now for two and cut out the first part? Is that possible technically?
I think we should start all over again because it's a pain in the butt to cut out the first part.
Okay.
Yeah, that means we need to send yet a new invite, right?
I was just thinking, no, I mean we can continue here, but just because we've done it twice now and.
No, that's I think it's good to double check, but it seems that that it is recording. So should we end it now and then start over again?
No, then you can continue. You can just start from the beginning and like we
because
just cut off.
You can cut it off, right?
Cut off the beginning.
You can?
Okay.
You have a tool to do that?
Yeah, in YouTube you can do that.
Okay. But we will do it. We will do it at our end. Okay, I'm starting over. 3, 2, 1. Good morning and good afternoon everyone, and happy 2017. Welcome to our webinar on carbon disclosure and climate risk in sovereign bonds. Ah, darn. Okay, let's start over again. Okay. So 3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon everyone, and happy 2017. Welcome to our webinar on carbon disclosure and climate risk in sovereign bonds. This is quite a hefty way to start the new year, but it is great to see so many of you online. We have over 100 participants already. A quick introduction. My name is Maximilian Horster. I'm a partner in the South Pole Group. This is cursed.
I know, I couldn't hear you.
No. What was this?
Was that your...
It was my internet connection. Sorry, I got kicked out. I had to dial in again. So that much about Bloomberg internet connection. But I also see that the presentation mode is. Good morning and good afternoon everyone, and happy 2017. Welcome to our webinar on carbon disclosure and climate risk in sovereign bonds. This is quite a hefty way to start into the new year, but it is great that so many of you tuned in. We have over 100 participants now. A quick introduction. My name is Maximilian Horster. I'm a partner in the South Pole Group. South Pole Group is the leading independent climate change specialist out there. We are 150 climate change professionals in 17 offices around the globe. We service around 1,000 clients, and we do that by measuring climate impact and climate risk, and we help reduce climate impact and risk. Since 7 years, we help investors now to understand and act upon their investment climate risks. While this entire topic of impact and risk measurement and investment started in the listed equity space, we now work across all asset classes, so we cover really every asset class. And with that, we remain a pioneer and an innovator in this space. And as such, we host regular webinars on specific topics. The one today I'm particularly excited about. It's on sovereign bonds. On the topic of climate risk, impact, and sovereign bonds, we established and applied the first methodology with a range of clients now. And in order to be able to do that, we partnered about a year ago with the leading think tank on ecological accounting, the Global Footprint Network. And together with the Global Footprint, we soft launched a report in December of last year that Susan Burns of the Global Footprint Network will introduce today on this webinar. Before I introduce Susan, three quick housekeeping items. First, you will be muted throughout the webinar, but secondly, you will be able to ask questions and comments, and I would ask you to use the questions or the chat function on the dashboard that you have to your right on the screen. And thirdly, the webinar will be recorded so you can listen to it again or pass it on. So let me now, without further ado, introduce Susan Burns to you. Susan is the co-founder of Global Footprint Network, and she served as Global Footprint Network's CEO for the past 10 years, during which she grew this organization to what it is today, really the leading house in its field. Today she is Director of Finance for Change, working with over 30 financial institutions on the implications of global ecological limits on investment portfolios. Susan, we are delighted to have you, and I'm very excited to hear your thoughts today. As always, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Max. And I just want to thank everybody at South Pole Group and the working group we put together to do this work for your great collaboration over the last year. So the work that we're doing in sovereign bonds really began over 5 years ago with a collaboration we had with UNEP FI. And at that time, very few sovereign bond investors were even considering environmental risk. Most investors thought the environmental risk was too long-term to really be material in the timeframes that they were concerned about. But some investors did suspect that there could be some impact on creditworthiness at the country level, and but there was just very little really material evidence really measuring environmental risk at the country level. So we launched a project called eRisk, which stands for Environmental Risk Integration and Sovereign Credit Analysis, and as part of that research, we found that indeed resource constraints and climate change are material at the country level for investors. They can be significant in some cases. And it's not that these risks are evenly distributed. They're quite unevenly distributed among countries. And not only that, they're not just long-term, that, you know, even though some environmental and resource risks take a long time to accumulate over time, their impacts can be felt in the short term and in the medium term as well. After that initial study, we did some further research into food price shocks, which has a link to climate change in that there is a sort of a gap between the amount of land we have to cultivate for food that's under a lot of increasing pressure compared to the amount of demand for food, and which is causing price volatility and higher prices. So we looked at the impact of food price shocks at the country level. And so this work into sovereign bonds and carbon and climate risk is sort of a third phase of what we're doing. We're really excited to be engaged in this topic, especially since there's been so much great work done by investors, but very little focus on sovereign bonds. And so when we, post Paris, in the lead up to Paris and also just following Paris, we were having conversations with bond investors who expressed an interest in measuring carbon and climate risk in their bond portfolios, but were kind of stopped by the, kind of a lack of clarity around the methodological choices and issues. And so, our goal really in doing this work was to help to demystify, to kind of give investors a sense of the landscape, and to have more confidence moving forward. And so in order to do that, we partnered with South Pole to gather 9 leading investors, asset managers and asset owners who are listed here on the screen. And I did want to give a big thank you to these participants, some of who are on the call today. It was a great process, very engaged group, and really knowledgeable group of people that we worked with to help to kind of walk through the different methodological choices and come up with a set of recommendations and sort of a guide to how to approach this asset class, which is laid out in this report. It's a 37-page report. We have some case studies in there, help you understand where to get data, and how to understand, just how you walk through approaching this asset class. We published the report in December. This is our first webinar to walk folks through the contents. We plan to do several other webinars this year in conjunction with some other organizations. And importantly, we're actually seeking feedback from investors. So we don't consider this report to be the be-all and end-all. It's really actually a jumping off point. And I encourage everybody on the call to click on the survey link and go ahead and give us your reactions, both to to the recommendations in the report or anything else you think needs to be covered. So today what I want to do is just briefly walk you through the different elements of the report, and then we'll be taking questions at the end. So to get started, a lot of investors are approaching sovereign bonds having already done a lot of work on the equity side. And so it's important to think about how do sovereign bond investments differ from equity investments, and obviously they differ in some really important ways. Number one, bond ownership is not the same as stock ownership. You're providing a loan rather than actually owning a part of a company. So the idea of ownership is a little bit different. And also the way carbon is measured at the company level versus a country level is completely different. So that really impacts the methodologies that we want to choose. And also then how risk translates into investment is completely different as well. The other thing that it was really clear to us as well as when approaching this asset class, or any asset class really, investor philosophy varies quite a bit when it comes to carbon and climate risk. Some investors take a pure investment risk approach. Others are, because of the influence of their customers, want to also look at the responsibility, like what kinds of investments are they investing in, and how is that contributing to a low carbon transition, for example. And still others want to look at the opportunities. So how can investors take advantage of the opportunities that are presenting themselves in this age of climate change and low carbon. So all those dimensions also come into play. And I would say just one thing about that: just make sure that your team is clear about which camp you fall into, or if you're going to employ a combination. I did see quite a few investors think they were taking a risk-based approach, but definitely mixing it in with responsibility, and so it's just important to kind of unpack that. So overall, though, one of our recommendations is that investors take a dashboard approach and look at these three key dimensions. One is transition risk, or you could just call it carbon exposure, which is the core of what's covered in the report. But there's two other important dimensions. One is the policy response. How is the government, the country, responding to climate change from a policy perspective? And what are their INDCs entail? How likely are they to follow through on those? And then thirdly, physical climate change is really thought of as a separate component, and by virtue of a country's geography, how exposed is it to the financial impacts of physical climate change? One other thing I would say on this topic is the topic of uncertainty. So both in the transition risk as well as physical climate change, there is a lot of uncertainty about, what a low carbon transition would look like, what's the pace of technological change, the policy environment. There's quite a lot that's uncertain, but overall, because we know that this is kind of an inevitable transition that the world is undergoing, that it's very, it's very good policy for investors to begin to get their head around this, and sooner rather than later. Okay, so overall, just want to give you a sense of what's in the report. The first topic we tackle is whether we want to look at an intensity approach or a debt outstanding approach, and we will provide recommendation there. We also touch on the topic of mixed asset class portfolios. We dive deeper into the topic of transition risk beyond carbon intensity. We look at a country's policy response, how might you think about that? And then we look at some variations. These are just topics that came up that if you're interested in, we provide some guidance. Net carbon footprint, for example. If a country is sequestering a lot of carbon through its growing forests, you might want to provide a credit or offset a country's emissions that way. You might want to limit the scope to government emissions only, and we provide some guidance there. Land use emissions are also one topic you might want to take up in addition to emissions from industrial processes. And then finally, cumulative or historical emissions. Some investors care a lot about that and want to see more from countries that have had a bigger role in creating climate change to begin with. Chapter 6 touches on the latest research in physical climate change and how that impacts creditworthiness. And then we have a chapter on sovereign green bonds, kind of a rapidly changing landscape there. France just announced a $9 billion sovereign green bond, and there's a whole handful of other countries that are primed to start to do that. And given the massive amounts of investments in sovereign green bonds, it's kind of an exciting development to see some countries thinking about how do I, implement our INDC commitments through the issuance of sovereign green bonds. And then the last section is the appendices, and we give you access to data sources as well as walk you through some example portfolios. Okay, let's get into the meat of the matter now. So the main thing we wanted to tackle is just the methodological choices that are presented to investors. First of all, you need to decide on your approach, whether it's an ownership approach or an intensity approach, and then the scope of emissions, and then finally how you want to measure carbon. On the ownership approach versus the intensity approach, we thought a lot about this because a lot of investors are coming to this having already done used an ownership approach in their corporate reporting. The natural assumption in some cases was we'd apply that to the country level, but there are several things that differ about sovereign bonds that are important to be aware of and can become somewhat problematic. And one thing I did want to say is the ownership approach and carbon intensity approach answer very different questions. So the ownership approach basically asks how much of the country's emissions am I financing with my investment, versus carbon intensity approach really focuses on the issuer. How carbon intense or efficient are the entities we're investing in? The ownership approach is more of a responsibility approach, and when it comes to looking at corporate reporting, for example, an investor looks at what are the emissions of the company, how much of that company do I own, therefore how much of its emissions have I financed, which makes sense from a company perspective. When you apply that to a country, it becomes a question did we really finance the emissions of the whole country in any way by providing a loan? Another issue is that if you apply the ownership approach to the portfolio and and maybe make decisions based on that, you would tend to look at countries with a lot of debt as having a lower carbon intensity from a debt outstanding perspective. So Japan, for example, with a lot of debt and relatively low emissions would look more efficient than a country with less debt and more emissions. So the debt actually really tends to skew the results, and which is just to say that it shouldn't really be used to manage the portfolio. It's more of an absolute number that you're calculating. But overall, as we went through this process, we had a high preference for the intensity approach for a number of reasons for a country. Basically, what we like about the intensity approach is that it's scalable. You can measure the carbon intensity of a country, of an individual sector. You can compare that with the carbon intensity of other countries or the globe as a whole. You can even compare the carbon intensity of a country with a company. Basically, the question is, how efficient is that machine, whether it's a company or a country, at generating value, revenue or GDP, for every ton of carbon it's emitting. So the other thing that we liked about it is it does provide insight into investment risk. So the more carbon intense an economy or an issuer, the more exposed to higher prices or other types of investment risk in a carbon constrained environment. So we built the rest of the report on the foundation of a carbon intensity approach. So the next decision we want to make is on scope. Now, you could say, you could argue that the government has issued a bond, and we're going to just look at the scope, the emissions of the government entity, the government services. Or you can look at the countrywide emissions, and we had a strong preference for looking at countrywide emissions. Just looking at government emissions would not give you the kind of insights that we think are important in terms of how much influence a government has on the policies of the country. It's transportation policy, energy policy, it's R&D, it's subsidies, everything that governments do to influence the emissions at the country level. So looking at countrywide emissions was especially given the fact that we want to start to look at credit risk seemed very important. There is one reason why an investor might want to look at government emissions, and that is that if it wants to avoid double counting, it wants to take an ownership approach, you could just measure the carbon emissions of the government, and then you wouldn't be engaged in double counting inside the country because you'd be looking at each company inside the country as well as the government itself. But aside from that, our strong preference is the countrywide approach. So once you start to look at that, you want to ask yourself, how do we want to measure the carbon intensity? The dominant mode for doing that in a lot of circles is really looking at production, but you could also look at the consumption of the economy, the consumption by the citizens of the country, and you can also start to look at the carbon embedded in trade. So we unpack each one of these in the report. So it's interesting to look at the difference between production and consumption. Production is just the emissions that are generated within the territory, the nation's territory, by the national economy. The consumption approach, and actually production includes the production of goods and services that are produced for export as well. So what it includes what the citizens, but what the economy produces both for domestic consumption as well as for exports. And then from the consumption approach, we're looking at the total or per capita emissions associated with the consumption of the inhabitants, the citizens of that country. And that would include imports, both what's consumed and produced domestically as well as what's consumed that's been imported. So there's really, our recommendation is that investors look at both because there can be very interesting insights depending on which lens you look at. This again shows the production carbon intensity of the top 20 economies of the world, and you can see they vary greatly. The global intensity benchmark is something that I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's the average carbon intensity that we will would be required in a low carbon transition, a 2-degree transition. I'll explain that a little bit more later. But looking at production and consumption side by side can show some interesting differences. So for countries that have a high amount of trade, they're not proportionally, there's not a very large difference. But in countries with less trade, you really start to see the differences, especially for exporting countries like Saudi Arabia and Australia, have much higher production carbon intensity than consumption. And in European countries, over here on the right-hand side, you can see, Italy, UK, France, Sweden, Switzerland have a higher consumption carbon intensity than production. Just the carbon intensity of their citizens is higher than the economy itself, and it tends to be countries that generate more income from service-oriented and higher value products. Can be one of the reasons. Now here's an interesting way of looking at consumption and production. If you think about consumption as being driven by individuals within the country, it makes sense to look at consumption emissions on a per capita basis. So that is shown here in the blue bars. And you can see some of the higher income countries like Canada and the United States have very high carbon intensity per capita. And then on the production basis, we look again at production on a per GDP basis. And you can really see how consumption drives production in the global economy. So a couple reasons why it's important, it would be insightful actually to look at both. One is from a risk perspective, it could be argued that a high per capita carbon intensity could entail some economic risk. So in the United States, where I'm from, our transportation systems, public transportation is not very well developed. We drive everywhere. Our carbon intensity of our energy is high, and in a carbon constrained world, these costs could come to bear at the household level and at the economic level. So, one thing to take a look at. But another important reason is from a policy perspective. If we only focus on production carbon efficiency, we'll tend to exacerbate this problem, which people call carbon leakage. Meaning that we're getting very efficient in high-income countries, but all of that carbon is being offshored through trade. And if we want to really lower carbon emissions globally, consumption is also a really important part of the picture. And finally, trade. So consumption and production do definitely give you insights into trade dimensions, but it's interesting just to look at trade itself. How exposed is a country, how dependent is a country on trade, and what is the nature of the embedded carbon in their trade? And you can see countries, differ vastly on that score. Now, I think that trade and how climate change impacts trade is a rapidly changing landscape and worthy of some additional research. With the way that countries are now starting to employ different policy instruments, there could be border taxes, there could be carbon prices, there can be more cap and trade systems, any number of mechanisms which might start to shift trade patterns, and countries may even start to look for lower carbon imports and shift trade as a result. So definitely something to take a look at. Okay, so that's really an overview of how you would look at carbon at the country level. And then we started to take this methodology and apply it in a practical sense. And very important to look at multi-asset class portfolios, because it's more often than not, sovereign bonds are intermingled with other assets in different portfolios. So taking a carbon intensity approach in general really just entails looking at the carbon intensity of the issuer and multiplying that by the exposure to the issuer. And in the case of sovereign bonds, we're looking at the carbon emissions per unit GDP and then how much of that country we have in our portfolio. I would just make a side note just to make sure everybody's clear. We're not concerned with the debt outstanding of the country in a carbon intensity approach. We're just concerned about how much of the country we own compared to our total sovereign bond exposure in our portfolio. In translating the carbon intensity approach to corporate bonds and to equity investments is very similar, except in the case of the company, we look at the company's emissions and divide it by revenue. And the same thing, goes for corporate bonds as well as equities. Now, that's one of the nice things about carbon intensity is it can be utilized in different asset classes because you're just focused on the carbon efficiency of the issuer. But a couple of things come into play that we address in the report in terms of comparability. So GDP is not exactly congruent to revenue, and so there's several adjustments we can make to the denominator to make that sync up better. And by the same token, the carbon emissions of a country are not always equivalent to a company's emissions, especially if we're just looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions. At a country level, the carbon emissions from the production, from a production perspective, are very inclusive. For a company, unless you have scope 3, you're not quite as inclusive. So we address that in the report, how to adjust the numerator and the denominator to help improve that situation. And then we took a look at an example portfolio. We've got a couple of examples in the report. For the mixed asset class portfolio, we chose the BlackRock Global Allocation Fund and performed the analysis and came up with these results. So you see a total carbon intensity of 253 tons per euro for the total portfolio, but we also, of course, broke it down by asset class for a bunch of reasons. Of course, one is if you're going to manage risk in these asset classes, you manage them very differently, asset class by asset class, and the drivers of carbon intensity are unique to each asset class. And so in order to just be actionable, you need to report individually. And also because of comparability, I should note that because of the imperfections of the comparability of carbon intensity across each, this isn't to say that sovereign bonds have a much higher carbon intensity and therefore we should shift into corporate bonds. You need to understand to what extent is the formula distorting the results and how much is it actually mean that, for example, equity investments are more carbon intensive than corporate bond. It's important to take a look at some of those dynamics. But overall, this, if you manage asset class by asset class, this analysis can be very helpful, and also for benchmarking to other portfolios in terms of carbon intensity. And then we separated out the sovereign bond portion of the fund and looked at countries individually. And it's just important to take a look at how much the countries make up of the portfolio and how much they contribute to the carbon intensity. And in the case of the United States, for example, the U.S. contributes more of a share of its to the carbon intensity of the portfolio than its weight would normally indicate. So important to, this is one starting point for any number of approaches. You could tilt your portfolio or, address carbon intensity in any number of ways. Okay, so taking another look at transition risk now. I mean, carbon intensity is one starting point. It can be sort of an exposure metric to see, as a starting point for understanding transition risk, but there are ways that transition risk can be enhanced in terms of how we understand it. And we have a couple of ideas that we present in the report. The first one is the same chart that we showed before, and just taking a look at the gap between a country's carbon intensity and the global intensity benchmark. How far do they have to go to get to what is likely to be necessary to keep warming to 2 degrees? Another way of looking at it, though, is to really start to take a look at a sector approach. So in a low carbon transition, it's not only the oil, gas, and coal sectors that will be impacted in terms of higher costs and stranded assets. Energy, is translated through every aspect of the economy, and so this indicator we've developed, which is called the intensive sector burden, takes into account how carbon intense sectors are inside of countries, and secondly, how dependent are these countries on those carbon intensive sectors. So it's really looking at two different things. China, for example, has 44 of its 57 sectors that are more carbon intense than the average sector worldwide. And so in the case of China here, you can see the sectors that are very carbon intensive. Of course, electricity pops up as prime, and gas, but it also translates into agricultural, forest products. Many other parts of the economy are more intense than the current global average intensity of sectors. That can entail some risk. Some really interesting work has been done recently by Moody's, and their work was applied at the corporate level, corporate equity, or I'm sorry, corporate bond level, just to look at which sectors have the highest exposure to carbon regulations. And the scenario that they applied was basically if every country adhered to its INDCs, and then in that case, which countries have the highest exposure. And you're probably all aware that over the last year, both Moody's and S&P have downgraded companies in light of mostly low energy prices, but we're also starting to see, Moody's, for example, looking at transition risk as an explicit risk that they're looking at, which is really great. And overall, though, I believe, and we believe, that more research needs to be done to really pinpoint transition risk at the country level and to really make a strong link between transition risk and actual credit risk. And the way that we think about that is to, first of all, start by looking at the structural position of the country, both in terms of its reserves and also how carbon intense the economy is. And we map out the transition mechanisms, whether it's regulatory or trade or technology. Any number of transition mechanisms can come into play in a variety of different scenarios. And the idea would be to stress test those countries to see how these transition mechanisms would translate into macroeconomic fundamentals like growth or inflation or trade, balance of payments, trade balance, and then therefore translating to credit risk. So we're very interested in collaborating with investors this year on starting to unpack that and really strengthening our understanding of transition risk. A recent study by Cambridge Econometrics showed, though, that by countries actually employing the right policies, there's more upside than downside. And so that's kind of the interesting topic, is really the countries that really are aggressive about policy changes stand to really gain quite a bit. And then by contrast, those that take a while to employ new policies could stand to lose. And we think that it's important for investors to understand that in a more quantitative manner. Okay, so the second to last topic today is just to look quickly at policy response. And we've done a lot of research to see, you're probably all aware, there's a lot of sources online that can help you understand what countries are doing vis-a-vis their INDCs and other policies. But the but the information isn't really geared towards investors just yet. And so I believe there needs to be a little bit more sort of massaging of this data so that investors can actually use it. And one way to think about it is, building again on the carbon intensity idea, is to understand what, to compare a country's trajectory with a global carbon intensity scenario. So if we want to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, overall we need to have a global carbon reduction scenario going to 0 by 2050. And if we assume a 3% growth rate, that we get a carbon intensity scenario shown here in this red line. And then we can compare different countries' paths to that. What's the gap? How are they decarbonizing at the same rate? Where do their INDCs actually get them if you project them out? And also, what has been their historical decarbonization progress? So that's kind of the way that we think about looking at the policy response from a quantitative perspective. And the last piece of the pie is physical climate change. And we present some of the latest research in the report. One very often used indicator is called the GAIN index, which is produced by Notre Dame University, which I think is very useful. And S&P has also used that indicator in the past. So that's one source. Another really great source is the work by S&P. And S&P has been involved in looking at climate change risk for many years. The latest report, they partnered with Swiss Re to understand the impact of weather-related disasters and how they might result in downgrades, credit downgrades. As you see in this chart, it shows the number of notches that would, that countries could be downgraded in a 1 in 250 year disaster. Actually, they also include earthquakes. And what we find is developing countries are most at risk from climate change, which is no surprise, just given their economic preparedness, and in addition, there's sort of a lack of enough insurance. So it's one of the things that Swiss Re is working on, is to ensure that countries are adequately insured. Second great study is from HSBC, and they look at climate change vulnerability as well as the ability of countries to adapt. And finally, our work through the eRisk project, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the impact of food price shocks, which can be exacerbated by climate change. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of, the dashboard and the different ways of looking at it. And then finally, I would just say, taking a look from an investor perspective, how do we want to, what do you do with these insights? Overall, I think investors have said that there's sort of a lack of products, and there really is a need for more innovation in the market to help investors act on this information. Our recommendation also is to go ahead and get started measuring your carbon intensity, benchmark your portfolios against other portfolios, and involve your portfolio managers and chief investment officers, because these issues are, they are material to investment risk moving forward. And then also, go ahead and take some steps to manage the risk. Even though carbon's not fully priced by any means, preparing for an inevitable low carbon and carbon constrained world is going to be a smart move. Okay, great. So I think we're at the point where we can turn it over to Max for some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. This was fascinating, and I encourage everyone on the call to read the report. Again, you can find it on the website of Global Footprint Network, footprintfinance.org, but also you will see the link in the chat box. We have a lot of questions coming in, so let's move right into them so that we can answer as many as possible before the webinar is over. So, Susan, the first question is, how much confidence do we have in the data, and is it difficult to obtain? So, question on data quality and data accessibility.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So yeah, data is definitely out there. Countries have been reporting carbon emission data for many years. The best sources are WRI for production level data, and then Global Footprint Network has good data on consumption and trade, the carbon embedded in trade. I think that carbon at the country level is somewhat more straightforward than carbon at the company level, which involves, complex supply chains. So yeah, the data is out there and is outlined in the report.
Thank you. This is great. On companies, of course, we have a lot to add to the discussion, but let's move on to the next question. Do you think eventually there should be a standard for reporting, or should investors adopt their own approaches? So, question on standardization. There are no standards out there. Is that what we should be going for, or should investors rather reflect their own DNA in the way they report on climate risk with sovereign bonds?
Mm-hmm. It might be a little early for standards since investors are just getting started in this asset class. And also I think investors these days are a little bit more concerned, well, quite a bit more concerned with what do you do with the information. So, rather than worry too much about standards, I think important for investors to just understand their own philosophy, go ahead and report and be transparent about the methods that you use, and then start to focus on positive responses to the information.
Yeah, I share this view. I think each of these questions could trigger its own webinar. Here's one question on double counting, which comes up quite often. If you have a mixed portfolio including equity shares as well as sovereign bonds, to what extent is double counting accounted for in the different approaches? So the logic, you lend money to a country and you account for the emissions of that country, and that country's emissions include the corporate emissions of companies operating in that country, and you invested in the company. Aren't you counting the emissions twice, and is that a problem?
Mm-hmm. That does come into play if you're using an ownership approach. But if with the carbon intensity approach, I think, the focus is on the efficiency of the issuer. And so I don't think it comes into play in the intensity approach. But with the ownership approach, certainly if you're taking responsibility for the emissions of a company inside of a country, then double counting would be an issue. Now, I guess the question also, though, is double counting such a problem, really? Because if you hold both investment instruments, you are exposed in both directions, both at the company and the country level. So, it sort of depends on how concerned you are with double counting. If you're very concerned about double counting at the country level, then you could, in theory, only report the emissions from government operations. In that sense, you would separate from the company.
Yeah. Yeah, so double exposure could mean double risk, so double counting might be something to look at, but it can be discarded as well, and the approach matters. So here's an interesting question from Chris Weber. Can you touch a bit more on the connection to transition risk? given each country is a sovereign actor under UNFCCC Paris Agreement, can't it largely control its exposure to transition risk through policy decisions? So transition risk, to paraphrase, is the risk of countries taking action on climate change. As a government, as a bond issuer, the country, of course, can steer how much transition risk there is by taking or not taking certain actions. How do you see that? What's your comment there?
Yeah, and I guess maybe I should have defined transition risk earlier too. It is transition risk is sort of assuming that the country and the chances are much higher post Paris that not all countries, but many countries will start moving in this direction. And transition risk basically says what are all the different ways in which that could come to play, and how might that hurt an economy or help. So yes, countries have a lot of control over that, but it definitely helps to have gotten an early start. So the longer a country's been at it is a benefit to the country, because some of these issues are structural and take a long time to transition or to change. UAE is one great example. They've been diversifying their economy for over a decade. They realized that they didn't want to rely only on oil revenue for the bulk of their national income a long time ago, and started to diversify, whereas countries like Venezuela are really feeling the pain right now. So that helps, and also, I think from an investor perspective, if a country, even if a country has a high carbon intensity, if it's acting vigorously from the policy dimension, I think that can be quite a bit of, give some comfort to an investor that the country's not going to be blindsided.
Yeah. So I hate to be the one to cut this off. We have time for maybe one more question, but we're already, kind of running out. So to what extent, this is the last question I take, to what extent does carbon intensity predict investment risk? So is there a link between investment risk and carbon intensity, and what's maybe missing there in the picture?
Yeah, so I think our opinion is that carbon intensity is sort of an exposure metric and can give a lens, but it's not as fine-tuned as it really could be, and which is why I think further research would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan. This was fascinating. I have to draw a line under the questions. We have many more that we didn't get to. We will answer them individually. If you out there are interested in learning more of how we apply this logic to investment portfolios and go beyond carbon emissions, look at other climate-related risk factors, more qualitative ones, dependence on tax revenues from oil, coal and gas, for example, or INDCs or so, please get in contact with us. We have done first work with investors and we can share that. Secondly, I would like to point at the next webinar, which is next week, 18th of January. It's a review of COP21, a digestion of COP21. Renat Heuberger, CEO of South Pole, will talk about the post-Paris world and the world with the Trump presidency. And 2 days later, on the 20th of January, in London, we will have an in-person breakfast event taking stock on where investors stand with regard to climate change and what to expect in 2017. So now I would like to thank Susan Burns from Global Footprint Network and her team, especially her colleague Rona, for this great presentation and a great report. Again, you can download the report on their website, and you are encouraged to comment on it. You find the link on the website as well. I'd like to thank my colleague Fatou for setting up the webinar, and I would like to thank the good folks at Bloomberg because they allowed me to use their facilities. I'm in their office in New York. The background noises are from Bloomberg, so thanks for allowing me to use this. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you again, Susan, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.